You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 17th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
no decisions about Ukraine without Ukraine. No decisions about Europe without Europe.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky sets out the terms for any kind of negotiations with Russia. But will Europe step up? As Emmanuel Macron holds an emergency meeting of the continent's leaders, we'll ask whether, after decades of turning a blind eye, something can be done about Russia. Also coming up in the next 60 minutes, the African Union Summit is held in Ethiopia, with a new chair of the Commission facing two major crises: the conflict involving Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the civil war in Sudan. Plus,
42% of all the aid that's gone to Gaza has come from the UAE. And I think part of it is because we had that relationship with Israel because of the Abrahamic Accord.
The former foreign minister of the UAE explains the importance of his nation in bringing regional adversaries together. We'll look at Monday's papers and find out why, if you overdid it a bit this weekend, you might want to move to Japan for a gentler start to the working week. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, to look at what else is happening in today's news. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described Donald Trump as the greatest friend his country has ever had in the White House. Reports from Lebanon say Israeli warplanes have carried out 3 airstrikes against Hezbollah in the east of the country. And Austria's Interior Minister has said that a knife attack in the town of Villach appears to be connected to the Islamic State group. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, after years of being accused of turning too much of a blind eye to Russia, it's perhaps taken the US Vice President J.D. Vance to force Europe to do something about its neighbour. In a speech to the Munich Security Conference on Friday, Vance accused Europe of suppressing free speech, failing to halt illegal migration and running in fear from voters' true beliefs. Combined with the decision not to invite Europe to peace talks later this week between the US and Russia, the continent has been left in a spin. Well, Andrew Mueller was at the Munich conference, and yesterday during Monocle on Sunday, he told me that this, although a shock to Europe, shouldn't really come as a surprise.
It's always been easy not to deal with Russia, not to confront Russia, not to recognise the threat that Russia poses. And you do have to wonder, and it's a question we've heard asked both sincerely and rhetorically this weekend, how many more wake-up calls is Europe going to need?
That was Andrew Mueller talking to us earlier on Monocle on Sunday yesterday. So with the French president now calling an emergency meeting of European leaders today, has Europe's moment of reckoning now arrived? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Suzanne Lynch, who's global playbook author and associate editor at Politico in Brussels. Good morning. Welcome back, Suzanne.
Good morning, Emma.
No one expected this to happen so fast with regards to Ukraine, Russia, America and Europe. It absolutely has left a trail of chaos since Friday, hasn't it?
It certainly has. I mean, the phone call that took place between Donald Trump and the Russian president, this is really, I think, what took people by surprise, that happened, that Trump went ahead and had that 90-minute phone call. What happened during that phone call, people are still trying to work out. So I was at Munich over the weekend, and this was the main aim of European officials, trying to decode Trump and try to find out more details about what he is planning in these negotiations with Russia. And frankly, they didn't get very far. We've seen a lot of mixed messaging coming from the United States, and we saw no detail in the speech that J.D. Vance gave at Munich about US plans on defence and security. So they're coming out of this meeting with very little, having learned very little. But what we do know is that Donald Trump has sent his top team, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and others, to Saudi Arabia. They're going to be meeting this week, probably Tuesday, to meet with Russian officials to kickstart these negotiations. They are happening now, and neither Europe, and it seems at this moment, neither Ukraine also, they are not going to be at the table for these discussions.
So we now have the European leaders galvanised by the French President Emmanuel Macron heading to Paris this afternoon, and they have a summit organised for today. It is, for the criticism that can be levied across Europe in terms of the speed at which it operates, this is a very fast move, isn't it?
It is, yes. Emmanuel Macron called this leaders meeting. Now, not all EU leaders are going. So a handful of countries, the biggest EU countries, plus the UK and the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, will also be there. So the meeting is taking place this afternoon. One of the main talking points we expect to come from that meeting is this question of whether Europe is prepared to send troops as part of some kind of peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. Obviously, Keir Starmer has said this overnight, that he's prepared to send UK troops. Now, Emmanuel Macron was the first person to raise this about a year ago when he refused to rule out sending French troops. That was seen as very controversial. It is controversial for a lot of countries. I mean, particularly Germany. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, he's going to this meeting today in Paris. He's coming off the campaign trail, though. I mean, we're just days away now for a German election. So it's very difficult to see what Germany can commit specifically when they're about to go to the polls. And secondly, there will probably be a new German Chancellor in power anyway. So it's going to be, the very fact the meeting is taking place is significant, as you say. We will probably see this discussion of troops and also about defence spending and what more Europe can do for Ukraine at this juncture.
It all sounds perfectly reasonable, but we're in a moment when reasonableness seems to be shaky at best. To try to coordinate responses, try to offer piecemeal, sending British troops to act as peacekeepers in Ukraine seems like a practical, sensible and almost short-term approach to the immediate problem. However, there have been these accusations for years and years that the European Union, Europe in general, has turned a blind eye to Russia, and this is now the moment when Europe really has to stand up. But what do we think it can do?
Well, I mean, the Europeans would say that over the last 3 years, it's taken very strong action against Russia in terms of sanctions. For example, it completely changed its energy supply systems, and the EU officials are meeting this week separately to agree the latest sanctions package against Russia. So they've definitely tried to hit Russia economically and also give Ukraine a lot of military aid. So even though, and this is the problem for Europe, that no matter what it does in terms of military aid, it cannot fill the gap that may be left by the United States if it wants to pull out. That's the problem. I mean, we've seen a huge change in European defence spending, a big increase, particularly in countries like Germany, in terms of how much money they're spending on defence and how much they've given to Ukraine. But as I say, it still won't fill that gap. And that's why Donald Trump has so much leverage here. He knows that America is the most important player here in terms of what happens next in Ukraine. If it stops the tap of military aid going to Ukraine, Ukraine will be in difficulty. So that's the leverage he has. The Europeans know that. Now we will probably hear today more commitments about more military spending, more aid for Ukraine. But the timing now, it's not going to happen overnight. So all they can hope for now is that there's some kind of consultation with Europe, and particularly Ukraine, as these so-called peace talks are beginning. Of course, the worry at Munich over the last few days was what Donald Trump has already offered, perhaps to the Russians before the negotiations have even started. Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, used the word appeasement, which of course is rich with symbolism at Munich, with the Munich Agreement that was signed in 1938 by Chamberlain. So I think there's a real worry about what happened during that phone call and what's going to happen in these discussions that are happening next week, particularly when the Europeans and the Ukrainians are not there.
In the long term, the strategy for the European Union or for Europe in general must be what? Given the fact that what you have just mentioned and has been widely reported, not only is Russia an enemy, we now have America becoming a chief, perhaps, adversary and blocker of progress.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think we are at a point where the transatlantic relationship has frayed, and the new US administration has made it clear that Europe is no longer a priority, I think, for the United States the way it once was, the way it was really since the end of the Second World War. And we heard the Defense Secretary, for example, talking about, even with NATO, that, the priority is China and what's happening in that part of the world, not Europe. So I think Europe realizes that it cannot count on the United States. I mean, the big question would be, where the rubber hits the road, is if Putin or if Russia either consciously or inadvertently hit or attacked in some way a NATO member state, would America step in under Article 5 of the NATO agreement and support Europe? Like that is really a lot of the fear here. Will this be enough to stop Putin, or ultimately by agreeing to some kind of deal, will this embolden Russia and, he may not stop there? So they're the kind of fears, particularly those countries in the east of Europe, are grappling with. But in the immediate term is to try, and I think the objective now for Europe is to try and exude enough influence that it's some way part of the discussions that are happening now so quickly over the future of Ukraine.
And when it comes to the European leaders' ability to communicate and sell this to their domestic audiences, at a time when a lot of faith in mainstream politics is being severely tested, not least in the likes of Germany, how willing do you believe that European citizens, how willing do you believe that European citizens are going to be to accept some very difficult and expensive decisions that their leaders are going to have to make?
Yeah, I think there is an issue about how much more Europe can afford. Obviously, with, if you spend much more money on defence, that is going to take money from other parts of national spending plans. And we see that now in Germany. There are huge discussions now running up to this election about spending priorities, budgetary constraints, etc. Although it does have to be said that Friedrich Merz, the person who's probably most likely going to be the next German chancellor, he's taken even a more pro-Ukraine stance than Olaf Scholz. So I think he feels there's enough support there behind him for that. But yeah, I think, Europe is prepared to do a bit more, but, there are implications for more spending on defence. That is going to eat away and impact budgets in other ways.
Suzanne Lynch, Global Playbook author and associate editor at Politico in Brussels, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. Just nudging 10:13 a.m. in Addis Ababa, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, the African Union summit was held this weekend at the Union's headquarters in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. They've elected a new chair of their commission, the Djibouti Foreign Minister Mahmoud Ali Yusuf. And they also heard a rousing speech from the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who celebrated the view that partnership between the UN and the African Union has never been stronger. Together, he said, we see an Africa brimming with hope and possibility. But the Union is dealing with two major crises at the moment, notably Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, I'm joined from Cape Town in South Africa by Daniel van Dalen, Senior Country Risk Analyst at Signal Risks. Very good morning to you, Daniel. So just explain to us the main takeaways from this summit. Yeah,
so I think overall, a lot of times these summits are hosted and there's a lot of expectations about what kind of might come out of it. So I think a lot of people that are kind of, looking at the continent at the moment were a little bit disappointed in terms of specifically, as you mentioned, about Sudan and the DRC. I think the main things the summit ended up focusing on, obviously, was the big conversation about reparations. Guterres obviously saying, 2 seats in the United Nations Security Council. And then obviously, as you mentioned, the AUC chairperson being elected. However, that's fine. But, the big things that were missing from the conference, unfortunately, were Sudan and the DRC, which we saw take a bit of a turn over the weekend. So again, obviously, these tickets and these items that were discussed in the AU, obviously important to some degree. But again, from an outside look in, I think it was a bit of a letdown and a bit, if I can say, boring overall in terms of what the leaders should have perhaps focused on instead. In what way was it a letdown? I think, you had this big kind of, and again, just to shift it back to the DRC, we had this big East African community, SADC community summit, big talk, big ceasefire. And, you're having all leaders of Africa come together over a weekend while the Rwandan-backed M23 strolls into, the South Kivu provincial capital and takes over another key city in the east. We also saw the fighting in Sudan escalate. These things are happening while, we saw videos of, African ministers partying a little bit in the Ethiopian capital. So I think, unfortunately, optically, it was not necessarily the best timing to perhaps host something like that while not addressing these very acute crises that are going on.
How much attention was given to the DRC Rwanda problem? I mean, there are real fears of a broader war here.
Yeah, not much at all. We saw very much things about our solidarity and, it needs to be discussed. But at the end of the day, Kagame and Tshisekedi, the respective presidents of Rwanda and the DRC, did not attend the summit. And at the most, again, broadly just more rhetoric as opposed to any sort of front and center, which perhaps should have been the case, especially off the momentum of the EAC and SADC summit that we've seen. That momentum has kind of died since. So the AU summit would have been the perfect time to do it, but unfortunately we didn't see it.
And was there also any mention of the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Sudan?
Again, all rhetoric, but we're not taking any decisive steps. And I think, unfortunately, that is where the AU historically and, now especially needs to kind of step up in its role to say, well, we need decisive action. We don't just need rhetoric. And again, front and center was things about reparation and the permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. And again, these are obviously important discussions to be having. But I just think, unfortunately, at a time where you have these unfolding issues that are massive and implicate regional actors and all of these things, they just didn't get to it properly.
Why do you believe that they didn't address the two most burning issues properly?
I think it's very difficult, you even see it with the EU and the AU. To get involved directly in a country's affairs is a bit of a contentious issue. We've also seen Sudan reject outright intervention and assistance and these types of things. And obviously, the regional countries and the AU are handling the DRC and Rwanda crisis very sensitively, because obviously you have a country that is effectively invading another one using a proxy group, but it's not an open conflict between the two countries technically. So, the AU is trying to handle this very gently in a sense. And I think, unfortunately, there was made perhaps a hope that the regional actors would address it as opposed to the AU, which had its own agenda, which would have been set, months in advance in any case. Again, unfortunately, is how much power does the AU have to intervene in these matters? Not much, nor is it probably willing to, aggravate tensions or bilateral ties that it has with these countries in any sort of, more firm stance that it takes. So I think, we might see more discussions in the coming months. But unfortunately, I think they will stop at discussions as opposed to decisive action.
What can be done to change this? Because we just mentioned a moment ago at the beginning of this programme the idea that Europe is now having to step up because it has a major crisis on its doorstep. Is there something that could and should galvanise the African Union to make it more relevant and to give it sharper teeth?
So I think the African Union definitely has relevance. I'm not necessarily saying that. I think, its lack of teeth, as you said, I think that is indicative of global bodies. I don't necessarily think that is completely isolated to the AU. We've seen it with the UN when it comes to Israel and Gaza. We've seen it with the UN when it comes to Ukraine. There is only so much that these intercontinental bodies or continental bodies can do without, violating a country's sovereignty. So unfortunately, the max that, the UN, the AU, what they can actually do is try and facilitate actors. They can, try and bring them to the table. But unfortunately, there are limited levers at their disposal to kind of force parties to come together. And equally, the AU doesn't want to now obviously upset specific parties. That creates its own issue. So I think, they serve their purpose. But unfortunately, these types of bodies have shown that, when it comes to decisive actions, intervention, sanctions, these types of things, they're very apprehensive to go ahead and do that. And I don't think there is a catalyst in which the AU would suddenly start taking more decisive action, especially when you have regional actors that are trying to play a more decisive role, in these two things, Sudan and the DRC. And
you also have international actors as well who are trying to play a more decisive role. I'm just thinking of the agreement between Russia and Sudan to build a port. I mean, that changes the dynamics and adds a sense of urgency as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, the longer that the West kind of takes a bit of a step back, you are opening the doors to the likes of China and Russia on the continent. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see more of that the longer that, I think the DRC is a prime example where you have obvious actors saying, well, we're denouncing Rwanda's actions, but we're not going to do anything about it. You look at the US, you look at the EU, they're not doing enough, and that resentment is going to grow eventually. I don't foresee suddenly a sudden shift in ties between the DRC and Russia, who's, the cordial at best at the moment. However, it could very well push it more towards China, which is already a key actor in the country. So I think, as you mentioned, there is probably a room for the EU to step in. And I think that's particularly important now more than ever, as you've seen a Trump administration that's kind of taking a step back in Africa. So there is definitely room for the EU to take more decisive action and play a greater kind of role in the continent, but obviously still letting domestic actors kind of take the charge and that kind of thing. But again, the Rwanda DRC issue is a prime example of where the EU can take decisive action and, kind of fill that decisive role that is required at this point in time.
Daniel Van Dalen, Senior Country Risk Analyst at Signal Risk. Thank you so much for joining us once again on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
You can't kill a political idea, but I don't think we necessarily have to give that political idea seats on any committee or a municipality or some group that is involved in rebuilding Gaza.
Anwar Mohammed Gargash, Senior Diplomatic Advisor to the UAE's President Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, talks about rebuilding Gaza without Hamas at the Munich Security Conference. Stay tuned.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:22 here in London. Let's have a look at today's newspapers. Joining me is Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent. Good morning, Ruth.
Morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us. What's life in the Michelson world at the moment doing?
Looking at the papers, looking at this rather rainy news, or the rain here in Istanbul. So I can't come to you with nice weather news, but feeling kind of also equally gloomy doesn't even really cut it. It's looking at what's happening in Germany, that the US Vice President J.D. Vance has showed up at the Munich Security Conference and has, well, as seems to be a pattern with the Trump administration, is causing chaos and has been accused by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is less than a week out of running for re-election, of interfering in Germany's political affairs. So J.D. Vance shows up, has a meeting with a far-right leader, that's Alice Weidel of the AfD. And despite going to the Munich Security Conference and claiming that he has been, thinking about the lessons learned after visiting a former concentration camp, at the same time then goes to meet with this far-right leader and also condemns a very long-standing political agreement in German politics that other parties work to have this firewall to keep the AfD out of power. And this has rather predictably sparked a fair amount of outrage in Germany, where, including from the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who has used his own speech over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference to talk about the idea of never again. Washington Post describing this as a wake-up call for Germany.
Indeed. I mean, just looking at Der Spiegel this morning, Olaf Scholz is urging European involvement in Ukraine peace talks. There seems to be a concerted effort by Scholz a week before an election which is likely to see him gone, trying to coordinate Germany to mount a strong resistance to what are very, very powerful influences. And the fact remains is that this is just happening before an election. And so these what's these so-called interferences, the fact that J.D. Vance is wading in on domestic politics, Elon Musk is wading in on domestic politics, it's an absolutely crucial and very dangerous time for Germany, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. And Elon Musk has already there's been a huge wave of criticism of Elon Musk's involvement in German politics going back months. But now to have the sitting vice president, I mean, we can make all the jokes that we want about Elon Musk as the president of the US, but to have a sitting vice president, in addition, come in and have these kinds of meetings, bolstering a far-right party that is currently polling in second place in Germany. So despite this this criticism that, or this discussion that other parties won't work with it, the AfD is set there. First of all, they're fielding a candidate for chancellor for the first time. They are set to have an unprecedented success for them in this election. And there are real fears in Germany about the effects of J.D. Vance's meeting with Alice Fidel and the kinds of support that he's giving to the AfD. And I think it's also quite telling, if we look at the responses from Friedrich Merz, who is the head of the CDU, the party that he's expected to get the largest share of votes in the Bundestag and expected to become the next chancellor. He did say at one point during the conference, there's an elephant in the room here, and the elephant is the transatlantic relationship. That's quoted in the New York Times. But that is talking about peace plans in Ukraine. When he's talking about election interference by the United States, which is surely part of that elephant in the room, his comments were a little bit more tepid and said things like, we stick to the rules imposed by our democratic institutions, which isn't exactly the sort of, firebrand response that you want to see to election interference by a supposed ally.
Let's talk about another area where the United States is having quite a strong involvement. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in the Middle East at the moment. At the same time when this week negotiations about the second stage of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas are due to take place. We don't have the location yet of where they're going to be. But Rubio's visit, again, has a very strong moment of timing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, he's showing up at this crucial moment. There are real concerns that this second stage of the ceasefire talks, which is meant to be about a permanent end to the war in Gaza, that this is really in doubt. And instead, what we've seen is that Rubio has shown up. He's had this press conference with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, and has pretty forcefully given his backing to Trump's, what the New York Times is calling a controversial vision, I think we would all put it a slightly different way, for transforming Gaza into an American-owned Riviera of the Middle East. New York Times pointing out this has overshadowed these rather high-stakes negotiations. They do say lower down that some Israeli officials consider the idea impractical. Experts say it would be a severe violation of international law. Might have been worth putting that up higher up in the article. But Rubio has now shown up and rather strenuously backed these plans, which of course will have an impact on these upcoming negotiations, because there is a perception across the Middle East. Rubio is meant to go to Riyadh today, to Abu Dhabi tomorrow, that the US is just going to wholesale back some of the most extremist parts of the Israeli political system. And as a result, will back a potential plan that people across the Arab world and in some of the capitals that Rubio is about to visit describe as ethnic cleansing.
Finally, let's talk about Elon Musk. Doge and those hired to effectively go through every single US government department with a dose of salt. There is now questions being raised about whether they can actually get into the Inland Revenue Service.
Yes, I mean, I think we should point out here that this is a 25-year-old software engineer who apparently is now pushing for access at the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. So, according to the New York Times, this would give Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency access to extremely sensitive taxpayer data. So this is obviously causing a huge amount of concern in the US. Basically there's a software engineer that wants to be given this like broad access to taxpayer data in the name, of course, of government efficiency. But there is already pushback as people from with more experience in government basically say that, while this might, there are some extremely old systems at the IRS, there are real fears about what could happen if this data is leaked, shared, or improperly used in any way. And this is, Americans' extremely sensitive taxpayer data. Would you give Elon Musk your banking information is really the question at heart here.
Ruth Michelson, thank you as ever for joining us on the line from Istanbul for the newspaper review. The time here in London is 7:30 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described Donald Trump as the greatest friend his country has ever had in the White House. Speaking after talks with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Mr. Netanyahu said the two countries had a common position on Gaza. Meanwhile, the second phase of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas is expected to begin this week. The location of the talks hasn't been made public. Reports from Lebanon say Israeli warplanes carried out 3 airstrikes in the east of the country. Israel hasn't confirmed the location of the attacks, but said it was targeting Hezbollah military sites containing weapons, including rocket launchers. And Austria's interior minister has said that a knife attack in the town of Villach appears to be connected to the Islamic State group. A 14-year-old boy was killed and 3 people remain in intensive care. The suspect is a 23-year-old Syrian asylum seeker. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, the inevitable focus of the Munich Security Conference was, as it has been since 2022, Ukraine. But other conflicts were discussed, not least the one in the Middle East, another arena in which the US President Donald Trump has made some policy proposals which might be charitably described as unorthodox, most obviously relocating the population of Gaza in order to convert the shattered strip into a beach resort. One of the more influential Middle Eastern diplomatic players at Munich was Dr. Anwar Mohammed Gargash, senior diplomatic advisor to the UAE President Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Gargash was for many years Foreign Minister of the UAE and was instrumental in normalising relations with Israel and brokering the Abraham Accords. He sat down with Monocle's Andrew Muller in Munich, who began by asking if, with hindsight, he still felt it was the right thing to do.
I think it's the right thing to do, because I think when you do something strategic like the Abrahamic Accords, you would necessarily see some headwinds at some stage. You will see some turbulence at some stage.
This is considerable turbulence, though.
This is considerable turbulence, but I think at the same time, it also gives us a sort of conduit, really, that is extremely important and necessary. So, for example, 42% of all the aid that's gone to Gaza has come from the UAE. 42% of all the aid. And it's allowed us to build field hospitals in Gaza. It's allowed us to airdrop support. It's allowed us to send planes, ships, clean water, etc. And I think this is part of it is because we had that relationship with Israel because of the Abrahamic Accord. So clearly, like every strategic decision, you can play a larger role in various developments. And I think our humanitarian record in supporting the people in Gaza shows that the Abrahamic Accords was our conduit here. I think as we're moving in a second Trump administration, and as we are seeing the Gaza war winding down, I think the Abrahamic Accords becomes even more central, because it gives us that sort of ability to speak to the Israelis with our Arab voice. They listen to some of what we say, but they at least know that this is an important thing. I think on the other hand, the Abrahamic Accords was a little bit also about us. As we're building more of a global country, global cities, as we're opening up with various countries, as we are trying to build more and more bridges, I think it was natural that for us also to do this with Israel. So it doesn't mean that because we have a relationship, we don't subscribe to the Arab consensus on a two-state solution. We do that, we support it, but I think we have now the advantage of these bridges and these conduits.
But is a two-state solution from where we are now really, do you think, still a realistic aspiration? Because Israel, as you know, has been fairly keen to not entertain any conversations about what a post-war settlement for Gaza might look like, and so far the most prominent idea on the table is that of President Donald Trump for turning it all into some sort of casino resort.
Well, I'll start by saying that public opinion in Israel and political opinion in Israel is varied. The far right does not necessarily represent all of Israeli public opinion. And I think it happens to be the government of the day. But at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant that the array of Israeli public opinion is much wider than that, and there are many people who believe that you either have one state with the Palestinians with full rights, or you have two states with the Palestinians living side by side with a Jewish state.
So presumably you're not on board with the idea of deporting the entire population to Jordan and Egypt.
I'll come back to that, but I will say that the two-state solution faces headwinds, but at the same time I think there is no other alternative. There is no other alternative on the table. So it's extremely important for a lot of countries in the world, and I think it's a majority of countries in the world, to keep the flame burning for a two-state solution because it's the right thing to do. With regards to the proposal on Gaza, I think the proposal itself is challenging us to address some of the issues. There is no way.
What issues such as who is going to police this and who is going to rebuild it?
Well, I'll come to that. I think number one, clearly, there is, I think, no consensus anywhere, especially in the Arab world, especially within the Palestinian narrative, of moving any Palestinians out of Gaza, and I think we subscribe to that. But I think at the same time, we have to engage with the United States. And engaging with the United States specifically on this subject means that we need to ask ourselves the questions. And some of these questions include the following. Number one is any arrangement that we will see should not be a prelude to a seventh war in Gaza, but that these arrangements will actually secure the people in Gaza, create some sort of greater security and safety for Israel, and provide also a political horizon for the Palestinians. I think what this proposal does is brings these to the forefront. I think on the other hand, what is essential also for us on the Palestinian side is the reform of the Palestinian Authority. And the UAE has been quite vocal on that. If the Palestinian Authority is to play a major role in Gaza, then it has to be seen as credibly reformed, that it is able to do what is necessary. And at the same time, I think also Hamas should not play a role really in this transition. It is important that we see a capable Palestinian, reformed Palestinian Authority playing that role. So I think the proposal itself will not happen, but what will take place is many of the questions surrounding it, and I think this is an important area, and we have to engage the United States on it.
On that specific point of Hamas not playing a role, who is going to stop them from playing a role and how?
Well, I think here is the importance of what is agreed as a transition in Gaza.
Sure.
So, as some people say, this is a political idea. You can't kill a political idea. But I don't think we necessarily have to give that political idea seats on any committee or municipality or some group that is involved in rebuilding Gaza, etc. And I think this is what we need to do. And I think these ideas are coming back to the forefront. They've been part of the debate and dialogue in the last year or so. Mm-hmm. But I think they're coming to the forefront as a result of President Trump's proposal.
And that was Dr. Anwar Gargash talking to Monocle's Andrew Muller at the Munich Security Conference. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, the Greek island of Santorini is still being rocked by thousands of earthquakes, and those who remain on the island are, by all accounts, exhausted, not just from the tremors, but from the constant state of alert under which they live, but also the relentless coverage in the media of just how bad things are. Well, I'm joined now from Santorini by the hotelier Marcos Haidemenos. His brand Cannaves collection includes villas and hotels. A very good morning to you, Marcos. How bad are things?
Honestly, it hasn't been a natural disaster, but rather a PR disaster. And the earthquakes have been very, very mild, very, very easy. And therefore, there were absolutely no damages or injuries. Life on the island goes on. Of course, many people left the island because they were worried, obviously. Even while living on the island, listening to the news, it's even more alarming than the reality. So many people left, but now they started coming back, which is very positive.
What's it like living day to day at the moment?
Honestly, I mean, life goes on normally. There's cafes, bars, restaurants, people go to work. And unfortunately, there is the state of alarm, which means that some construction sites remain closed until the 3rd of March. But other than that, schools are also closed for precautionary measures. Other than that, life goes on.
But living constantly, I mean, the reports that we are hearing is that you're experiencing not tens, not hundreds, but thousands of tremors. Is that what you're experiencing day to day? This slightly persistent sense that the ground beneath you is not stable?
So honestly, in the beginning of the phenomenon, yes, there were a couple of earthquakes per day that were of a magnitude of 4 until magnitude of 5. You can only feel the ones that are a little bit stronger than the micro earthquakes, let's say. So yes, you might hear that there is hundreds and thousands of small tremors, but you cannot really feel anything. You could only feel a couple of them per day. Recently, the past few days, the phenomenon has relaxed a lot, and you can only feel 1 or 2 earthquakes per day. Which are still mild. They are around a magnitude of 4. So, people are used to it, I guess.
What has all this done for your business?
In the beginning, I said it's rather a PR disaster, which means that obviously the media has made this situation much worse than it really is. And I received thousands and thousands of messages from colleagues, friends, people I work with, especially US or UK, asking me, "Are you okay? Are you safe?" And this is how people perceive the situation in their home. Like, there has been a natural disaster, and we are dying in Santorini. So this is not the case at all. But honestly, we don't have cancellations. People are very, very resilient with the whole situation. The flow of incoming new reservations had slowed down a little bit, but still people that are coming to Greece are still requesting for Santorini. They're still booking Santorini. Obviously, for the beginning of the season, April and May, hotels have become a little bit more flexible in terms of their cancellations and their non-refundable policies. So we're making it even more flexible for the people to travel to Santorini. Scientists are positive, and they say that it's going to be a couple of weeks, if not a couple of days, until this phenomenon is finished. They're not very worried, so we hope that it's going to be finished soon, and we can continue with our work.
There is now this issue of re-establishing trust in the island itself as a brand, isn't there?
Of course, I mean, safety is the most important part, and that's what we've been trying to do. Be inform properly our guests, our potential guests, and our employees. Employees is a very important part of the equation because many have left, and obviously you know that we need employees to start the hotels for the season. The good thing is that now the phenomenon has relaxed and many are returning. So this coming week, many employees are returning, and we're starting to maintain the hotels and become and get ready for the season.
Tell us what support you need from the outside world here, either from the government or from authorities or indeed from the luxury hotel industry, to try to communicate the message that you are having, which is clearly very different from what the rest of us are hearing.
The support that we need is for everybody to speak the facts and not crazy situations, and not depict the island as being a panic and evacuation. And I heard crazy things broadcasted by people, like they're evacuating the island. There was no such thing. Some people chose to leave the island because they didn't have work anymore. Some of them were worried. They decided to leave the island for a couple of days and come back. I mean, I even heard reports that they were dragging people out of their houses, which is totally not true. I mean, there is no panic on the island. And honestly, still now, there is tourism on the island. There are some people that are still visiting the island. Obviously, they have the whole island to themselves, but, it's not that bad. So it's very, very important for everybody to speak the facts. Listen to the scientists, listen to the local authorities about the safety measures. All the safety measures that have been taken are precautionary. And I have to say that the government did so well with all these precautionary measures. We're very, very proud of all their activities. But, some press, they took this the wrong way. And when they saw certain scenes, they thought that it's the end of the world, but it's really precautionary. So it's very, very important for people to speak the facts.
Marcos Haidamenos, thank you so much for joining us on the island of Santorini. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
.48 here in London. Time for a transport news roundup. I'm joined from Stockholm by Gabriel Lee, Monocle's transport correspondent. Good morning, Gabe.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. Let's begin with Portugal and TAP. One of the great sort of national carriers of Europe. And the Portuguese government doesn't know quite what to do with it, does it?
That's right. Yeah, they've announced that they're looking to sell quite a large share of it, at least. They've been kind of looking at this in various ways for many years. The airline has struggled for many years to make money, to do well, to excel. So now they're looking to, make it kind of official that they want to sell off quite a large stake as part of this drive towards privatizing the airline. And we'll see. The speculation now is about who are the potential buyers. And of course, one of the top sort of group of candidates is these large airline groups in Europe that have already been sort of swallowing up other airlines here and there. They're going to be very interested in the possibility, we think, but we don't know exactly yet.
So we're talking about the likes of Air France, KLM, Deutsche Lufthansa and indeed IAG. What does this say about legacy national carriers? That I remember once hearing the discussion that actually, to a certain degree, it does not matter, or it is not absolutely essential that a national carrier be wildly profitable, because its ability to sort of convey soft power is actually almost unmeasurable. And would that be a very naive suggestion to make in these days?
I think in Europe, it's no longer at play. I think that still is the case in many places. You see this where, governments, especially governments with money, such as in the Middle East, are willing to pour endless amounts of money into their airlines as for this reason. And I think there's a really good argument to make for that also, including in Europe, for TAP to be a proudly Portuguese brand. But that has gone away, mostly because of pressures from low-cost airlines, which have driven margins down, and everyone's out to sort of figure out how to cut costs and increase revenues. And they're desperately fighting for survival in some cases on many routes, especially with the likes of Ryanair, Wizz Air. So, all that kind of notion is pretty much gone in Europe. And, we see the sort of consolidation that we've seen as a result.
Let's move to more difficulties when it comes to electric aircraft. That persistent battle by the aviation world to try to wean itself off the traditional fuel-driven engines and trying a different kind of fuel. The electric aircraft developer Eviation is now struggling.
Yes, they've basically laid off almost all of their staff. And now this is not a huge team, but it speaks to big trouble there. And this is a manufacturer that has actually flown a real aircraft. They've got their aircraft Alice. It is built. It has been doing testing. A while back, it flew to great acclaim and fanfare because here we had a fully electric aircraft that could transport small numbers of people. We see a few other manufacturers trying this. The reality, as we've seen, is a lot of the promises have been difficult to actually reach. The viability, the economic viability, and regulatory viability, certifying these aircraft, which are full of batteries, it's a lot more difficult than maybe we thought at the beginning. So while there was a lot of investment to start off with, now it seems that in many cases the money is not there, and so that's Eviation's problem now. They just don't have the money to continue. They say they're laying off workers temporarily so that they can find how to get to the next step, basically to get more money, but it doesn't bode well.
Very briefly, let's talk about someone who has got a lot of money, and that's Riyadh Air.
Yes, the Saudis are putting so much into this startup, which is meant to be the kind of global-facing alternate to Saudia, the existing flag carrier of Saudi Arabia. That's the airline they want to push to compete with the likes of Emirates and Qatar Airways, and they are really pulling out all the stops to make a big splash with this. They haven't been able to start operations yet, mostly because of aircraft shortages. It's due to happen soon. They've been on a kind of hiring binge, and the latest thing they've done, which is very intriguing from a airline which hasn't started yet, is they've launched their Sonic brand, which basically involved inviting musicians from Saudi Arabia as well as abroad. They went to Abbey Road and they recorded this music that is due to kind of stand for their brand. It's a very interesting move. We haven't really seen anything quite like it, although I will say that the Middle Eastern airlines tend to be very good with their boarding music. So this is something that has been thought about before, but they're taking it to the next level.
Gabriel Lee, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're with The Globalist. Now, as this programme goes out live on a Monday morning, we're hoping you're all fresh as a daisy and ready for the week ahead. But if your Saturday night hijinks just happened to have happened on a Sunday, then perhaps you might wish to move to Japan, because a company based in Osaka isn't only offering future employees hangover leave, it's also offering them alcohol. And Pernilla Rudlin is Europe, Middle East and Africa representative of Japan Intercultural Consulting. Good morning to you, Pernilla.
Good morning.
So what is hangover leave? How does it work?
Well, I believe that you can't take the whole day off if you've feeling a bit under the weather, but you can at least rock up a little bit later than usual to work. So it's basically just a kind of flexible working without too many questions being asked, I suspect.
And do you pre-book it insofar as you look at your diary and you think, I'm going to be pressing the big red button at about midnight next Tuesday. Does this mean that next we can already write off Wednesdays? Or can you have those moments where serendipity occurs and the big red button is pressed completely by accident?
Do you know what? I don't know. I mean, it is only one company in quite a small one in Osaka that's doing this, but I think it's reflective of an attempt by at least the sort of smaller startup type companies to say, look, we can't offer the salaries that the big guys can, but some of the bigger Japanese traditional companies have become quite infamous amongst the younger generation for being places where you have to work really, really long hours and you have to turn up on time. And so I think this is just a way of them saying it's okay, you can take leave, do the work in your own time, and we won't ask too many questions. Plus also free beers from time to time.
Yes, which sets you on the path already. Just tell us a little bit more about the problem that Japanese companies are facing. You said there that the more traditional brands are asking for full commitment from their employees, and this isn't going down well with younger workers, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, I think that it's remarkable how similar it is to things that I hear here in the UK, actually, that the generation coming in now, they want jobs which they can feel like adding value straight away and not to have to do meaningless stuff all day. And that used to be the way it worked in Japan. You joined a big company, and for the first few years, you were just a sort of shadowing other people and not really doing anything of any great value or interest. But now, Japan's facing a massive labour shortage, particularly amongst the younger generation. It's a rapidly ageing and declining population. So even actually the big traditional companies, especially in IT, are having to be a lot more well, in fact, some of them have deliberately shut their headquarters and told everyone to work from home as much as possible, in fact.
What difference do you think that makes to Japanese working culture, which you've lived and worked there for a very, very long time, and there is a sense that Japan has a very distinct and very proud culture of hard work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating time of change at the moment, actually. It's something I've been saying for a very long time now. If you are going to offer people flexible working, you need to give them a very clear idea of what they're meant to be doing. And up until recently, most Japanese people did not have job descriptions. They would have a very generalist kind of career, and they weren't specialists at all. But you're now seeing in Japan a lot more sort of reskilling, retraining, people being much more specialist, which again, of course, suits, I think, the younger generation much better to feel that they do have a tangible set of skills. And yeah, I think that's the way to go. I mean, the worry I have, though, is that then they lose the good stuff, which is that Japanese companies generally offered you a job for life. But of course, that was on the condition that you were very flexible about what you did, hence the sort of generalist, no job description tradition that has grown up.
So do you fear that we're going to lose this?
I have a feeling it might. I mean, it already is happening in that fewer and fewer people are in that lifetime job category. And the younger generation are job hopping a lot more than their seniors used to.
Pernilla Redlin, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to the producers Hassan Anderson and Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.